Hello, everyone. Welcome to another binary episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre, with me is Z, who I'll let get into the Spot the Vuln solution here, which I believe is perhaps the first Spot the Vuln we've had in a while, at least, that nobody seemed to solve, and there's some interesting nuances there, so I'll let Z get into that.
Yeah, this one is I think, kind of an interesting bug, at least in my mind. That said, I might have also messed up, and this may or may not actually be exploitable. Um, so let me get into it. We've got a relatively simple web application here: register endpoint, verify email endpoint. So you have register, takes in a variety of fields from the user, stores them into this little user object, and just kind of stores it away somewhere. I stub that out, just insert pending user. It has all the fields you provided, stores it somewhere, and sends an email to the new user. That's supposed to be like your email verification. So you provide an email, sends in an email with code, you return. The second route that's defined here is verify email, and you give it the token. When you give it the token, it goes, looks up, hey, what user had this token, pulls that user back. So presumably that's that same information you provide during registration. That's all attacker controlled. From there, the only thing this application does is it parses the email address, splits on the N or on the @ sign, grabs kind of the domain from the email, everything after the @ and returns that as the organization. As long as it parses something, it adds the user to this organization. My thought on the vulnerability here was actually something that we have covered before. It returns that when it's getting the organization, it also uppercases the email. So if you provide in lowercase, it would just convert everything to uppercase and uses that as the organization, kind of as a form of normalization. So we did cover a kind of similar issue to this before, where there was an overlap in actually parsing. I think it was, I don't know if they use the term organization, but that idea where a user belonged to one group and was put into the wrong group, which is kind of what you're going for with this one. It's a bit more of a logical attack where, is there some way where you can get a user added to the wrong organization despite having validated their email? And my thinking with this challenge was that with this uppercase, if you provide Unicode characters, there are some Unicode characters that will, when you convert them between cases, going either from lower to upper, or if it's an uppercase character going to lower, will end up changing their representation, maybe going from one character to a couple of different ASCII characters, for example. I have a few examples of this that I could bring up, and I can't name what these characters are, but like, you've got this kind of B-looking character that when you uppercase it becomes SS, or one here that turns into S, FF. There's a few different cases for this. There used to be a tool that would list out the case folding conversions that could be used to kind of reference what characters you could use for what. I'm going to include the link here in our show notes. Actually, it's not showing up in chat, so I'll have to do that manually, but it's not loading for me. I'm not sure if this is just dead and it's never going to work again, or if it's just down today. It's been a while since I've used it. I had the link saved. So I'll have that in the show notes at least. It was just like the Unicode utility that would actually give you the complete list. And actually, no, I don't have the link. I was going to see if I had the link for the spec instead. Anyway, you have these kind of case conversion issues that happen. So jumping back to the actual vulnerability here, if you provided a kind of crafted domain that had one of these characters in it, in theory, you have the email sent down. When you send the email, it should get converted to like the punny code representation of whatever that host is. So the fact there are these weird characters shouldn't really matter. It gets converted to punny code, and you can have it go to like your whatever email. But because it's using the original user input when it comes to actually parse it for the host, rather than the email as like the email was sent to, the domain as it was sent to, You kind of have a desync there where it sends an email to one address, which is this honeycode version of the email. But the one that it's parsing here includes the Unicode characters. And so when it does this uppercase conversion, you have the potential for any of these characters I was showing earlier, if they're in that string, to be converted out to these characters. And thus you might be able to overlap with another existing organization inside, like, since the S character is one of these, like there was a Microsoft organization, Microsoft.com, only, accessible by people with a Microsoft email. You'd be able to create the domain that used this kind of R looking ish character. I don't know what you'd call that little hook. You would use that character, register the honeycode domain, so you get the email for it, get it back, and when it converts it to uppercase, it would become Microsoft.com instead of this random character in there. So that was kind of the vulnerability I was going for. Now, where I'm unsure about now, when I tested this, I didn't send it through any of the email. I just made sure, like, okay, yeah, this honeycode conversion happens how I expect, and I used CyberChef for that. Seems like, I'm not sure if CyberChef is the one in the wrong here or some of the other ones, but I just happened to use a different honeycode thing or converter as a test case earlier today, and it did not convert it in the same way. It actually basically wouldn't, or it would lowercase first and then convert. And in that case, using the uppercase here kind of doesn't work so well when it does the transformation to lowercase first. So there's a chance that this code may not have actually been exploitable how I expected. Just because I had used the CyberChef, it operated one way. Seems like there might be some difference there that I wasn't aware of. That kind of breaks the exploitability on this one. But the core issue with Unicode and with this case conversion is something to kind of keep in mind. This case may not have been exploitable. We have talked about at least one vuln in the past that took advantage of this issue. So, like, it is out there, but maybe not with the actual domain registrations exactly as I had it here.
I was about to say, yeah, the fundamental concept we've seen before, so it's valid, but how exploitable it is going to depend on the situation, what's being done internally, I guess. So,
with this, I kind of stubbed out the whole like send email is just a random function there and don't include how it works. So you could assume it works how I'm expecting it to, and like in this way that allows for the vulnerability. I hate doing that with the spot the vulns where you assume something's doing something vulnerable. In some cases, I'm fine with that, where it's a reasonable assumption. It just happens to interact in this vulnerable way, but I don't feel as good about this one, at least until I look into it a little bit more and understand the exact nuances of why there's that difference between what CyberChef was doing and what this other tool I was using was doing.
There's a little bit of ambiguity.
Yeah, no. I definitely, would hate to realize that I put up something that was just completely unexploitable. Yeah, sorry if you kind of thought about that and were like, oh no, it would do this other thing and it would be fine. But if you didn't think about it, this is a bug class to at least think about it. It doesn't come up too often, I'll be honest. I've only seen it once in the like personally on an assessment, and it wasn't in an exploitable way. Like, it wasn't doing anything security sensitive. So I've never actually exploited this one in the wild, but it is an interesting bug class to look for.
All right, so unfortunately today we don't have too many topics. We struggled finding some interesting ones, but we do have a few things to talk about, including a Windows DHCP v6 RCE, a paper on side channeling Linux kernel heap, and a discussion on Rust coming into the Windows kernel. We'll start off, though, with the ZDI post on an RCE in the Windows DHCP v6 service, which is actually the only vulnerability that we have this week for the binary side of things. Z, do you want to get into this one, or do you want me to go into it?
No, I can cover this one.
All right.
Yeah, it's not that interesting, honestly. Like Spectre said, we had some issues trying to come up with things for this episode. That said, it's still kind of fun. So it is a heap-based buffer overflow in the DHCP v6 server. And the key thing is when it's dealing with nested messages, specifically, you've got these relay forward messages. It'll create, or just in dealing with the messages, actually, it creates this 1664 byte buffer, which is 32. It's an array of 32 52 byte uh, structures. So you add all that up, you get the 1664 bytes. But effectively, it's just they have a fixed number of structures in there, and all the structures are the same size. They do some appropriate checking to make sure that oh, we're not adding like too many messages to this structure, and they keep track of the current index. They iterate through all the messages being parsed. But if you use nested messages, so if you send a single relay forward message that then has inside of it more than 32 nested messages, in the nesting, it doesn't actually do the bounce checking. So while it does the bounce checking outside of that, it doesn't do bounce checking inside of the nested, or in the code that handles the nesting. So you're able to provide more than 32, which is going to keep incrementing the index and go out of bounds into your out of bounds right there, potentially leading to code execution. So fairly straightforward, but also kind of fun to have the bug sit in basically deal with that edge case of having the nested message. Not necessarily an edge case is relatively common, but having it kind of sit in there, and that's where the bounce check was missing.
Yeah, I thought it was a bit interesting how it happens through like the nested relay forward messages, but yeah, it basically comes down to just allowing too many nested messages and going out of bounds on the buffer. It's somewhat your bog standard overflow, especially in the networking space.
Yeah,
These kinds of issues crop up a lot.
the overflow is definitely bog standard. The nested aspect's a little bit unique to it. Not special. Like this isn't anything that's too complicated to understand. Um, it's just they do the bounce check where it's obvious and not where it's less obvious, basically.
Yeah. All right, so getting into a paper, we have a paper coming out of Seoul National University and UNIST on doing side channel attacks on the Linux kernel Heap to improve reliability of heap-based kernel exploits. So I will say, the idea sounds kind of interesting at first blush, and I was kind of buying into it a little bit. That said, I also, like, while Z was covering this about the Vuln, I was actually talking a bit on Discord with somebody who pointed something out that I'll get into in a little bit. First, I'll cover what it's about, though. So the technique they talked about here is called PSPRAY, and how it works is fairly simplistic once you boil it down. They basically take advantage of the time it takes to allocate a buffer to try to determine whether or not it was allocated in a fresh slab or an existing one. And the methodology behind that is often when you're exploiting a heap overflow, well, pretty much all the time when you're exploiting a heap overflow, you want to set up some target object adjacent to your overflow point to be able to hit it and derive whatever primitives you're aiming for. Of course, if you miss that setup, you could just not trigger what you want, or you could end up crashing the system or something due to overwriting important data that you weren't expecting. And one of the ways you avoid this is with doing some heap shaping, right? You try to get your object next to the target allocation that you have, try to improve the chances of getting the object you want for corruption. And what they're aiming for here is determine when an allocation is made in a fresh slab and only try to trigger corruption in those cases. So basically, you're trying to avoid that case where you miss getting a target object set up adjacent to it so that you don't trigger a crash or something that can be detectable to improve your reliability. So it kind of makes sense when you're talking about it at face value. What they use for demonstrating that technique is the message send syscall, which is a pretty popular heap exploit syscall in Linux. It basically allows you to get like an arbitrary sized allocation into the heap, and it has some useful pointers and stuff in the header. And they basically time the amount of time it takes for the message send. If it takes a bit longer than you would expect, they figure it probably has to be allocating in a new slab for it. So simple idea. It seems effective given the metrics they have in here. So they tested 10 real world vulnerabilities, and they found their reliability improved from 56% to 97%. As always, though, I don't really put a ton of stock into these. The 56% figure in particular seems pretty low to me. Generally, shaping the Linux kernel heap, especially in the higher kmalloc caches, unless you're not doing it like sufficiently well, it's not going to be that unstable. Like I think the main one they target here is the kmalloc 4096 slab, which you should absolutely have higher than 56% reliability if you're doing a sufficient amount of heap spraying. But
Yeah, and
anyway,
that number was kind of mysterious to me. Like they don't have a footnote on it or anything. It's just like, yeah, the average was 56% or whatever, and like no further information.
it's
Um
kind of a just trust me, bro statement. Yeah.
yeah, and it definitely, raised some warning flags about this paper. They do have an appendix which talks about success rate according to number of dummy objects. Which I'm not sure is entirely related to that, but seems like it could be. But they're not using success rate, I think, in the way that we would usually think of it, like the success of the exploit.
You think
In
they're
that
using it in
case,
just terms of like just not crashing?
well, in terms of this appendix, it's their success rate with the fixed number of like the way they're calculating it isn't in the sense of like the exploit landed this many of times or this many times, like.
Yeah, it's a little. I kind of see what you're saying now. Reading into it a bit more. Um, the other thing, though, which I didn't really think of too much at when I first read this paper, but like I said, I was talking to someone on Discord a bit whilst he was covering the spot the Vuln, and the other problem is, for the most part, on modern kernel configurations, you're going to have randomization inside of the slabs. So, like the order of allocations inside of the slab is not going to be sequential. It's not going to be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, going from lowest address to higher address inside of that slab. It's going to be randomized. So basically, what they're trying for here sounds kind of cool if you don't think about it too much. Where it's like, yeah, they try to get an empty slab out, the target object allocated in an empty slab, and then you just overflow into that slab and you're likely to hit it. But the problem is, like, guaranteeing the allocation ends up in an empty slab doesn't really do much for you, because yeah, like it can be anywhere inside of that slab, and you can have other allocations going into that slab too if it's a kmalloc marked slab. So yeah, it's a little bit weird. It sounds like kind of a cool idea, but I don't think in practice it matters very much. I don't think it's going to give you too much. That said, it is fun to see exploring into, going into something different than just spray the heap a bunch of times. It seems to be going for more of like a, what's the word, like a neat approach. Trying to not bombard the heap, but instead be a bit smarter about it. That said, yeah, I did have some problems with some of their metrics in here. I don't think they reflect the real situation of like heap exploitation in Linux very well. I think it's being a bit disingenuous about how reliable heap, like underselling basically how reliable heap shaping techniques already are in the Linux landscape, and kind of overselling what this can do. Because, like I said, guaranteeing an empty your allocation ending up in an empty slab doesn't really do much for you, because of that
Well,
randomization.
so even with that randomization, you're still going to have that allocation aligned inside of the slab, I believe. Like even with the randomization, it's not completely random. It is going to be aligned. So the 4096 is still going to be like 4096 aligned within that slab. So as you're overflowing, let's assume you've just got a big overflow, you can do the whole thing. Um, you're able to just target all the right offsets. And if you know you're the first one inside that, like nothing else should be, I mean, you do have the chance of like something racing and ending up in there too. But if you know you're the only object inside of this slab, you overflow the entire slab, overwriting the exact offsets you want. Now, that does depend on being able to actually do that. That does depend on being able to craft the entire object you want. So that doesn't work when you only want to overwrite like up to a certain point. But there is at least a little bit of a benefit to knowing that. Like there is a use case here. Um, I agree. I don't feel like they gave it a good treatment over like the downfalls of it, whereas they kind of treat it as like this just generically better, and I don't think that's the case. But I do think knowing you're empty, even with the randomization, knowing the slab is empty except for your object does give you some more flexibility with what you're overflowing with and how you're doing that, because you do just have a limited number of places your object might be in. It doesn't have to be the next thing in memory. Just, you have your kind of set offsets that it'll end up at, I believe.
Yeah. So overall, like you said, I don't think it's generically applicable to like practical scenarios very much. But there are some cases where it might be useful, and I think the idea is still kind of neat, even though it might not be, inherently useful. Um, Trying to, use timing information to derive the heap state, um, it is an interesting idea. I will give it that, which is why I thought it would be worth covering here, even though some of the people I know, and myself included, have some you know find the applicability kind of questionable.
I'd
So
basically say, like, it's just one of those things you can toss in the toolbox. You might end up in the right scenario for it. It's not something like this is how exploits are going to be written in the future or something. Like, it's not that impactful. I
it's not
like the
changing the meta.
idea of using a timing side channel as part of the exploitation, though. Um,
Yeah.
it reminds me a bit of, with the Spectre vulnerabilities and stuff. We saw a little bit of kernel exploitation trying to use that, although I do remember one of them was like what was it, a like multi-day long exploit to leak enough information. So
Yeah.
not the most practical thing, but it's fun to see these other sorts of attacks actually finding, even though you're saying not that practical, like finding a bit of a more practical use at least. A lot of like timing side channels aren't that practical when it comes to like, any sort of web attack. Timing side channels are pretty rough to deal with. So then they require like low level hardware access, which is already kind of game over in a lot of cases. So it's fun to see in this sort of case. And it is something worth some exploration.
Yeah. So getting into our last topic of discussion, we have a discussion around Rust coming into the ecosystem a little bit more. So we've seen it creep into various operating systems the last year or two. Linux is a big one that comes to mind. Google also announced trying to transition into using more memory safe languages for Android stuff. And it seems now Microsoft is bringing it more into Windows as well. They've announced they're bringing it into the Windows kernel. And we figured we use it as a bit of a launching off point to talk about Rust a bit. It's been a while since we've talked about it, and someone in the Discord brought it up as something to talk about. So, um,
Yeah,
yeah,
and we've had other requests to talk about too, like YouTube and stuff. So I figure it was worth getting into again. We did talk about this a bit in length on episode 69, when Linux announced that they were adding it into like Linux Next, I think was that discussion when it was just coming up. Is like, we're going to explore and see if this is a good idea or not. So we did talk about once before. That was quite a while back. So it's worth kind of returning to this.
yeah. Um, so Rust is a little bit of an interesting discussion, especially when you're talking about desktop. And I actually have another tweet that I thought I'd bring up here. Again, it was one of those things where I was talking with some people about it in Discord, where it got brought up. But it was by David Weston, or D Wizzle, is like his online handle. And he said, for those listening, the tweet was always fascinating to see the outsized attention, exploitation, and memory safety get. Of all things I announced in my talk, running Windows without admin is measurably the most positive change and defeats a large chunk of the attack post exploitation. Attack being ATTNCK. It's like the threat intel sphere for the list of like possible attacks or whatever. Still, Rust
It's
gets
out
attention.
from Miters publishes the like attack framework stuff. And
Yeah,
really quickly, I will mention because he talks about of all the things I announced in my talk. So at Blue Hat IL, he gave a talk about Windows security, future of all that, kind of what they're planning and having security by default. Um, so I'm just bringing that up here. There you go. Should have the link in the show notes, but there's also that talk, which is what he's referring to and kind of what spawned Both that tweet, the register news post that we brought up here also.
Yeah. So with Windows specifically, I believe it was announced that they're going to be starting to transition some of the Windows core libraries into like a Rust rewrite, which, as we've talked about with Rust before, when it comes to memory corruption, using memory safe languages is a fair step to take. Of course, it's not going to mitigate all types of issues, especially in the kernel where you're going to be using unsafe and whatnot. It's not going to kill memory corruption entirely, but it does reduce your attack surface quite a bit, and make auditing easier as well for finding more of the memory corruption style issues.
Yeah, I
Um,
think auditing is the big thing Rust does. It's not that Rust is
yeah,
more secure. I mean, Rust does have some security guarantees, but the big thing is like those security guarantees can and are often going to be well, not necessarily they're just often going to be violated, but they're going to step into unsafe code to do things that you just can't safely do. It's just by marking it as unsafe, that's where the attention gets go, because basically every memory corruption, as far as I'm aware, except for one, which was like pre Rust 1.0 day, super early, and core language bug, except for one, has always been introduced either unsafe code broke a violation that safe code later relied on, or kind of why can't I think of the way to so you basically have either unsafe code introduces it or unsafe, basically unsafe code is always involved. I'll just leave it at that rather than trying to explain the whole taxonomy of Rust phones, but unsafe code is always involved, so you can audit the unsafe code and kind of focus in a lot more. It's a lot easier to audit unsafe code than it is to audit the entire code base for unsafe things. Of course, there are also more data oriented and logic level attacks that aren't going to be caught by unsafe at all.
yeah. The other point that's brought forward to the table when Rust is being talked about is the fact that while it will mitigate memory corruptions, of course, it won't mitigate your more logical style issues where it was just like a permission check was missed or something like that. That's not really going to be fixed necessarily, unless it's caught in the rewrite, maybe. But I think that's stretching it a little bit. Um, you know, Rust itself isn't going to prevent those types of issues, and that's kind of what David Weston is sitting on here. Is more the fact that, especially in the desktop space, I think memory corruption is a little bit less important than it is in, say, the mobile space, where iOS and Android and whatnot have kind of moved on and don't really encounter the same types of permission issues that you see as much in like Windows, for example. So you kind of have to resort more towards memory corruption. Whereas with Ubuntu and Windows, for example, just recently Z mentioned this to me before we started the show, and it's a good point. Was that ZDI recently announced with Pwn to Own that they're not going to be accepting, like in their last event, they didn't accept Ubuntu LPEs as function to offset UID binaries. You had to attack the kernel. And Windows is sort of in the same situation where I don't think memory corruption is often the path of least resistance in desktop. There's just easier targets to go for, like the permission issues, especially where like Windows, was running as admin for so long. It seems that's finally, changing a little bit. But yeah, I think memory corruption is sort of oversold, I guess, or overrepresented in the desktop space. It is the flashier thing to talk about. It's more exciting. There's some cool nuances you can get into, whereas a permission bypass for the most part is just like, hey, they didn't check it here. That's it. Thanks for coming to my TED talk.
Yeah, but
It's not as flashy to talk about, but it does contribute more to like the security issues in desktop, and that those sorts of issues are where Rust itself isn't really going to help. So I think it is worth keeping that in mind, even though you are seeing more memory safe languages come in. uh, it's not going to fix everything. There are still various areas where either memory corruption won't be mitigated, or memory corruption just isn't that relevant, or as relevant as people like to think.
yeah, I'm not sure if I at least entirely agree with you on the lack of relevance for memory corruption. Um, yes, a lot of vulnerabilities exist that are just really high level kind of service, privileged services running. and it's exploitable. That definitely, exists. There's a ton of those really bad services. Like every antivirus out there is also like your backdoor into having a privileged access. Um, you have that, but that also depends on you on like the victim or whatever having that installed, or on a red team engagement, like whoever. It depends on them actually having that installed. Corporate environment, you could actually make some assumptions on that pretty nicely about them having like an EDR or something. Um, so like you can maybe depend on that a little bit more, but on the flip side, like a kernel vulnerability, memory corruption in the kernel depends on having the kernel, which everybody has. Like you don't have that dependency that you have with kind of going the service route. And I don't think you have as much of the same issue with like just the default services that Windows deploys with. Somebody who's more on the Windows realm and who does like, especially any red teamers out there can probably correct me if I'm wrong about that. But my understanding is like a lot of the Windows services aren't just innately broken, but your third party other things you're going to install maybe would be. Um, but I do like a big thing is almost everybody just runs as admin by default, and then there's just like UAC, which I don't know if we want to get into the discussion about like what Microsoft considers a security boundary, but you kind of have that aspect where everybody's running with high privileges and limited or minimal security boundaries already. So he calls out in this tweet, uh, Windows without admin is measurably the most positive change. And like honestly, it is. Like that is a huge change if they're pushing for that, pushing to have people actually running a user account. That's going to be massive for just reducing the attack surface. Probably more impactful than a lot than cutting down on memory corruption. But if we want to keep this focused on the impact of Rust and kind of how Rust impacts VR, like I guess the Spectre ended off with um, memory corruption still going to exist in Rust binary. It's going to be easier to audit for, which is going to limit the, I guess, frequency of vulnerabilities. Like if you're needing to mark everything as unsafe, you're suddenly a little bit more aware and thinking about what you're doing than you might be when everything is unsafe, when like there is no distinction. You kind of just fall into the pattern. It's like, oh, why do I need to make this unsafe? What am I actually doing here? Hopefully with that awareness, it'll cut down on at least some of the vulnerabilities, but like, even if everything were written in Rust, there's still room for exploitation there. I think just in general, like this ties in with my thoughts on the future of like memory corruption is it'll get more difficult, but also just vulnerabilities are going to push more towards those logical issues. We've talked about seeing memory corruptions introduced with more logical issues in the past too. Like just because it's a logical issue doesn't mean you're getting no memory corruption out of it. And Rust doesn't do a lot to prevent those sort of logical things. So I think as we see more Rust, and I think it's a positive change to move towards that, it's just kind of shifting the style of vulnerabilities, and you've just got to kind of keep up with it. And of course, there's going to be plenty of old code out there that is not running in Rust, and that you can still exploit like it's the 90s.
That's kind of how I'd summarize my thoughts, is that it's definitely not a bad step. It is a good step to migrate more code into, the more memory safe languages. But it's not like something that you should like bank all of your eggs into, I guess, like into that basket. It's not going to stop the logical style attacks or memory corruption through unsafe. So it's something to keep in mind. It's not like it's going to kill memory corruption, as sometimes people seem to echo for whatever reason. That there is more nuance to it than that. It is a good step. But yeah, like you said, it's just going to shift the exploitation landscape.
And it will likely,
as per usual with mitigations and stuff.
It will likely kill some attacks and like some number of attacks. Like there will, with a move to Rust, there probably, I don't have like proper stats on, but there will probably be fewer vulnerabilities, in part because of some of the things I've talked about, like the awareness of unsafe as you're writing it. So like if everything moved to Rust, there would probably be fewer, but not none. It doesn't get rid of everything. People still make mistakes. But I mean, it's another step. It's kind of like a certain mitigations kind of eliminate or make more difficult entire bug classes. But that doesn't mean there's no more exploitation after you have those mitigations. It just means things change and keep up with it.
It's a good way to summarize it. Yeah, I thought it was kind of an interesting discussion that was spawned off both like this tweet and just Rust coming in more into the operating system space in general. And yeah, like it is fun to think about the distinction you have between like desktop, where your attack surface is a lot larger, compared to something like mobile, where it's some years ahead in terms of like attack surface mitigation, and things like Rust coming in are a little bit more impactful, I think. Yeah, there's an interesting dichotomy between the different spheres of operating systems. Like mobile and IoT, I think memory corruption is more of a concern for, and trying to hit it compared to desktop.
Well,
So
mobile is still like, the 90s for exploitation. Like it's still, overflow the saved return address, have your NOP sled, and, do all of
sorry, you're
that.
thinking of IoT, I assume, not mobile.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, IoT is like that. Mobile, it's not. Actually, one of the things with mobile, I'm not even sure if it's necessarily just years ahead, as you said. It's a completely different paradigm. Like mobile has gone this whole route. Like you can't just install these very privileged services. You can have some permissions, but they're a far cry from like system privileges or root privileges. Like it's nowhere near just that same level of access. Like it prevents the users from having that same degree of access from the get-go. And I don't
It's a
think
more
we're
layered
ever going to
security
get
model
there.
in general.
Yeah, like I don't think we're ever going to get there on like desktop where everybody's used to being able to just install anything. Phones kind of got that fresh start and we're able to move into that. But I don't see us
At least
getting
not through
there on
Windows.
desktop too soon.
Yeah, at least not through the mainstream operating systems. Obviously, there are some, Linux-based operating systems that are more focused on that. Do use things like SE Linux and some of the stuff you see in phones, but people generally don't use them because they're a major pain in the ass to use. For, and that's why you're probably not really going to see that sort of layered permission system come into Windows, for example.
This is going to be year of future.
Year of future. Maybe we'll see it by 2030. It's always fun to, when a new year comes around, you're like, oh yeah, fuchsia is technically a thing, but not really.
I haven't heard much development on fuchsia, to be honest, lately.
In my brain, I classify it as a dead project because I think it
might be.
Yeah,
I mean,
I don't think it's officially dead, but it's basically dead for all practical purposes.
It's beside the point, anyhow. Like more of my thing was like on Windows, or Windows versus the mobile. Like they're very, very different paradigm over what's there. And I do just want to quickly shout out, as we're talking about this, another bit of news recently was that sudo and su were also being rewritten in Rust. So while we had the focus on the Microsoft stuff, Linux obviously has added it into the kernel over the past couple years, and those core binaries, sudo and su, starting to be rewritten as like Rust projects. So getting rid of some of the vulnerabilities there. And in the last couple of years, we have seen a few interesting sudo vulnerabilities. Can't think of any for su actually, but we've definitely seen for sudo. I won't be surprised to see there were su ones, but I can't think of any off the top of my head.
I can't really think of many practical memory corruption based exploits that have worked for sudo or su in general, like the last few years.
We've had like the Qualys ones. We covered them on the podcast a while back. I think it was maybe around this time last year where we had sudo vulnerabilities, like what was it? Baron Same Edit or something. It had a weird kind of name there.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I'm just not remembering. But typically with sudo and su and those types of binaries, you're seeing more, like we cover them more on the bounty episodes and the binary ones, because it's more just again, more of those
I
logical
don't
type
know if we've
issues.
covered pseudo on the bounty episode. I think we've mostly covered it on the binary. But yeah, this one that I was thinking of, I'm at least for Baron Sim, I guess was 2021, January of 2021. But it was a heap based in pseudo. And
Oh,
I
okay.
just remember this one because one of the exploit techniques they took was to modify, I believe, like a log folder path or a log file path. And then they did the log rotate.d kind of attack where you get command execution through log rotate. But they did that sort of attack with it, so I thought it was just an interesting approach on like a data-oriented approach in terms of exploiting pseudo rather than actually getting like code execution inside of pseudo. That's why this one comes to mind, but I know we've covered some other pseudo vulnerabilities also. I can't think of any like super high level logic ones in pseudo specifically though. But yeah.
Yeah. I think that's pretty much all the points that we wanted to bring up with Rust in the future of VR. It is something we've touched on a few times before, but like I said, it's been a while, and it is kind of relevant to the discussion again, where it's coming into more places. So yeah, we figured we'd do a discussion around it. That said, unless you have any last minute thoughts, see, that's all we have for today. So I think we'll probably wrap it up here.
Yeah, I guess my last thoughts are, if you're interested in the memory corruption stuff, even in the wake of Rust, you can kind of keep going. It's still going to be around for a while.
Yeah. All right. So thanks everyone who tuned in. If you want to catch any past episodes, you can find them on Twitch and all of them on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more off of Anchor. Feel free to join the Discord and follow us on Twitter. Links to those are down below or in the chat. We'll post there whenever we're going live or whenever other content comes out. And we just like to have some discussions in there too. Like I said, our Rust discussion kind of came off the back of the Discord. So yeah, with that said, we'll see you next week.